Get ready to rumble. Schilling Show Unleashed on the Seven Thunders Media Network. Former city councilor, husband, father, and community watchdog. Your host, Rob Schilling.
Welcome to the Schilling Show Unleashed Podcast. Remember, your direct support makes our show possible, and you can directly support this podcast by visiting shillingshow.com and then clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page to make a monthly contribution. We appreciate your support. The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast welcomes Rick Robinson, a political and pop culture columnist, the best-selling author of the new book 1968, A Primer for Understanding Baby Boomers. Rick Robinson, thanks for joining us today on the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast.
Rob, it's great to be here. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, and I've enjoyed reading this book and taking a trip down memory lane, and there are some parallels with today, but let's start with your infatuation with 1968. What is it about that year?
I have always been infatuated with 1968, Rob. I don't know what it is about the year. Maybe it's the music, maybe it was the political climate, but I've always been just fascinated by it. When people would always say to me, "Oh, country's going to hell in a handbasket," my standard response was always, "Well, it ain't 1968 now, is it? We don't have a war going on. We don't have people coming home in body bags. We don't have, leaders being assassinated on the street." That was all kind of my idea behind it. I was working on my next novel, and I went down to the library to actually take a look at something that I had to look at a book as opposed to trying to look up online. I just kind of started looking at newspapers from 1968 for my own just enjoyment. And suddenly as I was looking through there, it's like, oh my gosh, there's a book here. There's a book here because so much of it is the foundation of what us baby boomers are about. Number one, and there were so many comparisons to what's going on socially, politically, otherwise today in this country.
You know what's interesting about that year and the things that I read in your book was there was kind of a lot of dichotomies going on. While the country was experienced a lot of upheaval and social problems, there were also in the media portrayals of a very different America. How did you reconcile those two things when you were growing up? Like what was really happening versus what you were being shown in some of the television shows and movies of the era?
As I look back on it, I'm a baby boomer, but as P.J. O'Rourke, the great conservative humorist, would have put me in the freshman class of baby boomers. I'm on the younger side of them, although I got a lot of gray hair now. And so my recollection of 1968 is from a different point of view than somebody who's even a bit older than me. But my point of view was I remember the things that were happening at the time, and I remember how traumatic they were in the little town that I was growing up in. I remember walking home from vacation Bible school with my cousin Cindy as we walked into the house to watch the funeral train of Bobby Kennedy going from New York to Washington. I remember the riots that occurred and the unrest that occurred in our area surrounding the death of Dr. King. One thing that really hits home during all this time, Rob, is that everything about 1968 was about Vietnam. No matter where you reach to, it was all about and all connected to what was going on over there. And the recollections that I have of that are all from, I tell people my grandmother had the biggest console television in all of the town, which was, I think, about 13 inches wide, in a console set that probably was 6 feet long. Guys who went to school with my sisters gathering at the house in fear of watching the lottery on television. If you can imagine this, the lottery, as the ping pong balls came out and they put the dates up of what your draft number was a televised event. Even though there were only 3 channels at the time, every channel ran it. And all these guys were sitting in my grandma's living room. Might have been that my sisters were there, that they wanted to come down and watch it there. I'm not sure. The angst, the anticipation, the watching them as those numbers popped up and as they grabbed those, that's really kind of the basis of the year, I think.
And there was a lot of rioting and protesting going on, colleges being taken over. How did that affect our society? Because this is things that we had not seen previously, at least not like that.
One of the things, Rob, when you talk about everything that's old is new again.
Yes.
If you remember earlier this year, there was a takeover at Columbia University, and the state police had to be called in to break up the protest. To the day in 1968, police had to be called into Columbia University to break up a protest. Everybody says to me, well, at least they were protesting the Vietnam War. It was something, that they thought was important. I said, the original Columbia protest started over where they were going to put the gymnasium.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, it didn't have anything to do with Vietnam. It had everything to do over where they were putting the gym. They occupied the administration building, the student protesters did in 68. And I think as somebody said, well, what are your demands? And somebody said, well, we ought to throw that Vietnam thing in there too. And suddenly the protest became about Vietnam. But that's going to be, I think, an interesting position when the Democrats get to Chicago. Interestingly enough, Chicago in 1968, Chicago this year, riots in 68. What will the unrest be in Chicago this year? Will the whole world be watching, or will the whole world be watching Netflix like me? That's going to be an interesting time.
Well, it certainly will. And it's interesting that your book is available now. And I'm wondering how many people of today's generation are even cognizant of or know that there was unrest in the similar place in 1968. It almost seems like a different world, Rick.
Is a different world. Some people buy the book out of nostalgia. Some people buy the book out of curiosity. But everybody who buys the book, and you've read the book, comes back and goes, wow, it's the same issues we're talking about.
I'd like to bring up the assassinations that you referenced earlier, and I recently had the opportunity to interview RFK Jr., and it was a little eerie thinking of the history that he lived through with his own family. But we had these two monumental figures in American life, Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy, both assassinated in the same year. That must have rocked the nation.
It was a horrible time politically, and it was a time that was gut-wrenching beyond words. So what I did for the book, Rob, is that for a month I read every newspaper that I could, put together a timeline for that month of what happened, what the important issues were. But then I also went out and tried to find somebody at each month as I went through who was there. When I talk about the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, I found a doctor who was at a field surgeon at a field hospital in the jungle in Vietnam. When I talked about Dr. King, I went down and talked with a dear friend of mine who was the first African-American police officer in one of the larger communities in our area. It was interesting to see how the pain and how everything felt, he still felt today. The part of him that was interesting in the interview was that at the time he was a high school African-American man who had been studying up on the Black Panthers, H. Rap Brown, the leaders of the Panther movement at the time. That was where he had been going. And suddenly King is assassinated. He said, I had to sit down and reconcile in my own head which way I wanted to go. Whether I wanted to go the way of violence or whether I wanted to go the way of Dr. King with peaceful protesting. He ended up being a police officer. As we laughed at the time, he did go the way of Dr. King.
Did we have people at the time who were engaged in conspiracy theories or considerations with these violent assassinations and really rocking the nation, or did people just accept them for what they were at the time?
For the most part, I think from the standpoint of those assassinations, at the time, people accepted them. You have to remember at the time, the news source, Rob, was 3 stations.
Yeah.
There was no cable. There was no find your opinion and watch the news that matches your opinion news. There was the news. There was Cronkite. There was Huntley and Brinkley. That was it. And that's how you got your news. And they were institutions that were trusted. I find it interesting now in later years, as we look back on those, that in particular, the Kennedy family wonders was Saran, the only person there. Was Bobby Kennedy perhaps hit by friendly fire from a police officer? Was something else? Was there a second shooter in the room? And the Kings actually cast the same doubt upon the assassination of Dr. King and James Earl Ray. So it's interesting that that's a back look. Now, is that because of everybody talks about conspiracies now and that was just what is next for them, or do they really have something there? It's hard to tell.
The ability for us to tune out, we can either micro tune in as you referenced, or we could tune out and go to something like Netflix and just ignore the world, was not available to people in 1968. So Rick, what did people do in order to cope with all of this societal stress they were experiencing?
Well, as you take a look back, they drank, they smoked pot, and they listened to a lot of music, depending on what area you were in. But the tension of the time is important. I think that's really what you're getting out there, is the tension of the time. To me, 68 represented really a turning point in the Vietnam War and how Americans thought about the Vietnam War, as opposed to it being on a level of watching television. Everybody talks about this was the first war that we watched at the dinner table, but there was something much more personal that was going on during this time frame, and that was the arrival of the car. If you had a son in Vietnam and you're sitting having breakfast one morning and a green, no white walls car with two officers in it shows up at your doorstep, you knew what that meant. You knew what that meant. And when the neighbors saw the car pulling in on either side of you, they knew what it meant. They knew that somebody was there to deliver news that somebody had been killed in Vietnam. I think it almost started ruminating from that kind of a level of watching what was going on in Chicago, watching the protests, watching what was going on later on in the streets of New York, watching those things that were happening, but putting into context of going, my son's over there, Bob's son's over there, Margaret's son, that's the type of thing that really started changing, I believe, the thought about Vietnam.
You mentioned the news media and the media being more trusted. What happened to unravel that? And was there any fraying in 1968 of trust in the media? No,
that was just it. You listened to the news, you went out into the backyard, you leaned over the fence with your neighbor, and you talked about it. I don't think that during that time frame, nobody really thought about, oh, he's a Democrat, he's a Republican, she's an independent. It wasn't thought about that. You watched the news, you had opinions, you nodded to each other, and that was about it. The angst started coming as we started having cable and news outlets. The ability to have a news channel that matches your opinion. You got to remember, in 68, we watched the news to form an opinion. Mm-hmm. Today, we have an opinion, and we find a news channel that matches where it is we stand.
The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast continues with our guest, Rick Robinson, and the book 1968 in just a moment.
Get your fix online at schillingshow.com.
ShillingShowMedia.com is your one-stop shop for websites, audio and video production, and photography.
ShillingShowMedia.com will take your project from conception to completion.
ShillingShowMedia.com is reasonably priced and highly professional.
Need a website for your business? Visit ShillingShowMedia.com.
Need a video created or edited? Visit ShillingShowMedia.com.
Have a photography or graphic design project? Visit ShillingShowMedia.com.
ShillingShowMedia.com is your one-stop shop for websites, audio and video production, and photography.
Visit ShillingShowMedia.com. That's ShillingShowMedia.com.
Schilling Show Unleashed.
The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast, we return. Author Rick Robinson is with us. The book, 1968, A Primer for Understanding Baby Boomers. Let's talk about television. That was an escape, and there were a lot of shows that started in that year and many that were popular in that year. I want to go to Laugh-In, which I remember watching as a kid. A lot of stars were born from Laugh-In.
Oh, my gosh. Laugh-In, the Smothers Brothers, the Monkees, Batman. You look at all these shows that were going on. They were iconic at the time. Laugh-In became the political pushing point, along with the Smothers Brothers, on television that represented the counterculture. Interestingly enough, they were nowhere near what was going on in the real counterculture, on Laugh-In in particular, Smothers Brothers a little bit more. But as you took a look at what was coming up, people started realizing, oh, there's a voting block out there. One of the skits where they used to have was a segment where people would walk across the stage or jump onto the screen, and suddenly they would say, "Sock it to me, sock it to me, sock it to me." And somebody would hit them with in the face with a pie, or hit them with a big blow-up gavel. Who suddenly appears one day doing the sock it to me? Richard Nixon, because he was so hip with the young people. But Nixon shows up on Laugh-In because it's suddenly what is out there getting the ratings and getting the people, and he's trying to make himself a little more likable to younger voters. So there you see on television Richard Milhouse Nixon saying, "Sock it to me."
How did that go over with that crowd? Was that considered laughable, or did people actually admire him for stepping out of his comfort zone?
The Nixon-Humphrey race is such an interesting race when you look at what was going on in the country. You have Lyndon Johnson, who is president in 1968, running for re-election. The first primary at the time, Rob, was New Hampshire. So Johnson goes into New Hampshire against Gene McCarthy, who is the anti-war candidate at the time. And Johnson wins, but not by much. And he sees the writing on the wall. Same time that's going on, Walter Cronkite ends up going over to Vietnam, spending a week over there, come back and does a late evening report, an hour report at 10 o'clock on CBS, concluding that the war can't be won. Johnson then determines, if I've lost Cronkite, I've lost the nation. He gets out of the race. Jumping in the race at the same time is Bobby Kennedy Jr. Humphrey jumps in as the supported candidate of Lyndon Johnson. Kennedy is assassinated. They end up getting to Chicago with a real bifurcated convention. And the one thing, and this is one of the similarities I really see going on today, is that Humphrey had agreed that he would back Johnson's position on Vietnam. There was a peace plank that was going to be brought up on the convention floor. Humphrey had to oppose that. That was part of the deal between he and Johnson. Well, the peace plank comes up. It gets a lot of votes. It causes a lot of consternation at the convention. You see the riots that are going on outside, people getting bashed in the head. Chicago police are coming in. One congressman referring to it as Gestapo tactics in the streets of Chicago. And Humphrey comes out supporting the war and supporting Johnson's efforts. And he is so bruised, so beat up, that he has absolutely no chance whatsoever of winning the election. Interesting thing that is going to happen next week at the convention for the Democrats, I think, is going to be similar plank. What are they going to do about Gaza? Is there going to be a plank somewhere put in the convention about supporting Israel, supporting Palestine, supporting a two-state solution? Very much split in the party. And we haven't seen any of that yet because they're still on the sugar high over the announcement of Biden out and Harris in. I think that could cause some of the same problems going into the fall election as it did in 1968.
On the lighter side, there was a candidacy which was considered to be really funny. That was Pat Paulsen. Tell us about the Pat Paulsen candidacy for president, what that was like in 1968.
The greatest candidate of all times, Patrick Layton Paulsen, who once said, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself," and, of course, the boogeyman. Paulsen was a stand-up comedian, kind of folk singer. He was a writer on the Smothers Brothers. And he would come on the Smothers Brothers and do these editorial comments. Very funny, very deadpan. People loved him. So one day they start spreading the rumor that he's going to run for president. Interestingly enough, the FEC got involved. The Federal Election Commission got involved and said, if you're going to run for president, you got to give all these other comedians extra time, equal time. Well, they decide to go for it. And they actually go in and make Pat Paulsen a political candidate. He ran on the Straight Talking American Government Party, or the STAG Party. He was opposed to gun control. He thought everybody should have a gun and let them wear it, but he'd lock up all the bullets. He always said he wasn't right wing or left wing. He was more middle of the bird. So, and the slogan that year is "We've up our standards, now up yours."
Now, it seems to me, Rick, that Pat Paulsen was kind of a perennial candidate. It wasn't just that year, was it? Didn't he continue this for some
Pat
number
Paulsen
of years?
Ran every year after that. I was a delegate to the Bob Dole, Jack Kemp convention in '96. And I'm walking down the street, going to the convention center, and they're standing in the middle of the street with a TV camera on him. Is Pat Paulsen holding a jar to raise money for his next presidential campaign? Stopped, talked to the guy, said, "Pat, you're the reason I got into politics. You made me laugh when I was a kid. You're the reason I got interested in all of this. I even have your album from when you ran for president. I know all of the words from it." He said, "All right, let me give you a line." He gave me a line. I gave him the punch line back. He looks over at his wife and he said, "Honey, I found the one guy who bought it." Yeah, Pat ran every year until he passed away of an inoperable brain tumor shortly after I got to meet him in San Diego.
The fashion of the time was really interesting, and we should talk about the politics of hair, because that was making a major statement if you defied what had been the norm for so many years.
It is amazing to read through the newspapers at the time and see the headlines that just make you guffaw today. A young man in our community not allowed to graduate because his hair was too long. Now, mind you, I've seen the picture of this guy. We're not talking that he was Greg Allman. I mean, it was, barely over his ears.
Yeah.
But those types of social things at the time came through. Local school board banning Catcher in the Rye. Libraries happening today. What books are we not going to let people read? You look at things that are happening from that perspective and those social perspectives. The one thing that was interesting about doing the research on this was getting used to the context of the times, because the racial language used, the misogynistic language that was used in '68 would never fly in the newspapers today. A couple headlines just are funny to look at. I mean, there was one, the League of Women Voters were having a open forum and inviting the community to come. And the headline in the newspaper was, "Our women, God bless them, they have opinions too." Headlines like, "Boys want to know, should they date a girl that smokes pot?" Whereas when I went to college and high school a little bit later, it was, boys want to know, should they trust anybody who doesn't smoke pot? So it's interesting to look at the times and look at what is going on during that from the headline standpoint.
There also was a change in the type of clothing, a lot of wild clothing. If you look back on some of the television shows, you can see it coming in, where there was very traditional dress and then they just went nuts, which was actually pretty cool.
Rob, you really want to see what you would look like in big bell bottoms and a Nehru jacket? I mean, come on, Rob. Is that really your future? Is that really what you want to wear to church next week? Some of the tie-dye, some of the things that were going on there, it was a part of the counterculture of this longer hair, wearing different looking clothes. You have the militant groups dressing like militants. It is an interesting time frame for that. Although I would, again, unless it's on The Simpsons, I don't see anybody wanting to really adopt a lot of the fashion choices of 1968 today.
Rick, what were the lessons learned from 1968?
Well, I think the biggest lesson that we can learn from 1968 is don't forget the past. Because as we take a look at this, one of the people that I interviewed, and I mentioned this, was a doctor who was in the middle of the jungle, literally, during Tet. In fact, was at the only field hospital authorized to take civilians. So you can imagine that during Tet Offensive, where, in one day, 250 American soldiers were killed, he was in the middle of it. And he said something to me that really, really hit home with me, was that it seems like every 10, 20 years or so, we forget about Vietnam and decide we need to be somewhere else. If there's one thing I would point out to everybody, is going, man, don't forget the past, because it will repeat itself.
It's a good lesson, and I hope people are listening. Rick Robinson, if people want to get a copy of your book, 1968, A Primer for Understanding Baby Boomers, or if they want to follow your efforts online, where can they do that?
You can take a look on Amazon at their bookstore. They have lots of copies available. You can go to my publisher, Headline Books. And if you want to follow me, you can follow me on Facebook.
Rick Robinson, you've done a remarkable job capturing the time and helping us to remember the history. Thank you so much for joining us today on the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast.
Thanks, Rob.
That concludes another edition of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Visit us online at shillingshow.com, where you can directly support this podcast by clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page and making a monthly donation. Your support is essential for the continuation of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Until next time,